You're listening to the Nourish Child Podcast, episode number 28, Managing Type 1 Diabetes in Children with Sylvia White. I'm Jill Castle, registered dietitian, childhood nutrition expert, and host of the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of raising healthy kids inside and out. Today, we are talking about type 1 diabetes in children. According to the American Diabetes Association, more than 18,000 youth are diagnosed each year with type 1 diabetes. 5% of our population, including children and adults, have type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is a condition of high blood sugar levels caused by a lack of insulin production in the body. In type 1, the body does not produce insulin, so when kids eat food, the starches and sugars from food get broken down into glucose, and that glucose accumulates in the blood. Since there's no insulin to help usher it into the cells to be used for energy, children experience side effects from those high blood sugar levels. Today I'm interviewing Sylvia White, and she's going to talk with us about how to manage children with diabetes, particularly their food and their insulin administration, so that they can stay in good blood sugar control and prevent any future health complications. So whether you're a parent, a teacher, a friend, a relative, or a healthcare provider, this show will definitely help you better understand what's at stake when a child has type 1 diabetes.
Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. If this is your first time here, thanks for tuning in and giving the Nourish Child Podcast a try. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the show today. The topic of type 1 diabetes is particularly close to my heart. My husband, his father had type 1 diabetes, and I unfortunately never got to meet the man, but I've heard many wonderful stories over the years about what a great dude he was. I had also always heard that type 1 diabetes skips a generation, and that was something that has always stuck in my mind because being a mom of 4 children, my children are the skipped generation. So I particularly wanted to address this question with my guest today, which she very adequately debunks the myth around the skipping a generation, which was really great for me to hear. I've also worked with kids who have type 1 diabetes a long time ago. I don't take care of children today with diabetes because the landscape and medical management of diabetes has changed quite a bit, and it's a very specialized area, and I am not of that specialty. That's why we have people like Sylvia who does such a fantastic job managing children. So I wanted to also interview her and get an update, just see what's going on in the field of diabetes management, particularly as it pertains to children. So I hope that you enjoy the topic today. You may not have a child with diabetes, but you may know a child with type 1 diabetes. So I thought that this topic would be a great thing to cover in the event you need to know and understand some of the symptoms that could happen with a child who might be experiencing a low blood sugar or a high blood sugar, and just have a little bit more awareness to the needs of children with type 1 diabetes. Sylvia White is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator who lives in the Memphis, Tennessee area. You will be able to notice that she's from Tennessee when you hear her speak. She's been an RD for over 25 years. She specializes in diabetes. She has 3 children of her own, 2 of which have type 1 diabetes and are on insulin pumps. Thus, this really inspired her to become a certified diabetes educator and work with parents and kids with diabetes. So she has firsthand knowledge on a personal level, and she'll tell us a little bit more about her story, but she also has that professional knowledge as well. Before we get into the interview, I just want to make an announcement. This episode is sponsored by the Kids Healthy Weight Project, an online course for parents who want to create healthy meals and snacks, break the mold of negative, ineffective feeding, and plant the seeds of healthy habits for a lifetime. If you have a picky eater, an overeater, or an unhealthy eater, this is the course you need to restructure, reshape, and renew the nutrition and feeding practices in your home. Don't miss the opportunity to get the nutrition education you should have received the day you became a parent. For more info, visit my website, www.jillcastle.com/Kids Healthy Weight Project. I'll include a link in the show notes for this episode. Again, those show note links will be at www.jillcastle.com/028. That's 028 for episode number 28. Hey, Sylvia. Welcome to the Nourish Child podcast.
Hi, Jill. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited about this.
I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad that you're here to share your knowledge about diabetes in children. I think it's a really important topic, and for me, not one that I'm really very actively working with at this time in my career. I did a long time ago, but I'm certain all of the tools and technology has really changed since then. So I'm excited to have you update everybody. But before we get going, let's just introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm Sylvia White. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a CDE, which is a certified diabetes educator. I specialize in diabetes. I got into it because as a teen, I just loved reading books on nutrition and cooking. So I ended up getting a dietetics degree and worked as a dietitian for several years. I ended up going back and getting a licensed counselor, a master's in counseling degree, and I was working as an inpatient psychiatric therapist, and then 2 of my 3 children were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes within 10 months of each other.
Wow. How old were they when they were diagnosed?
My son was 12 and my daughter had just turned 6. She was in kindergarten.
Wow, that's I'm sure that was a very overwhelming time for you.
Yes, it was a rough year.
And may I ask, how did that all come about? Was there something that precipitated their diagnosis, or?
Both of them, for probably about a week or so before they were diagnosed, both of them had a high fever, and not really any other symptoms other than a fever. And I can remember them, staying home for a couple of days. And then with my son, he was diagnosed first in February of 2006. And my husband noticed that when we would put him to bed, he would get up and go to the bathroom, 30 minutes after he had gone to bed. So we just noted he was urinating a lot more. My other son had a urinary reflux problem as a kid. So I just thought, this is some kind of urinary thing. So I took him to the doctor thinking it was a urinary tract infection or something, and they checked his blood sugar and it was high. And so they immediately sent us to the endocrinologist, and it all started there.
Wow. So most definitely, I'm sure your interest in diabetes was very personal, probably as well as professional. And what better, not what better way to dive into it, but, you had a necessity there that you had to fill for your own family, which really helped you, I'm sure, get very practical with the management of diabetes. So for the listeners today, let's just go over some of the basic stuff, like what is diabetes? I know there's 2 types. Can you kind of cover that and some of the symptoms that go along with it?
Okay, sure. So just in general, the body, the pancreas is what has the cells that make insulin. So whenever people eat food, especially the food that has the carbohydrates, then the blood sugar goes up and the pancreas will send out insulin that helps the body just use the sugar or the carbs in the food, and that's what converts it to energy. So in diabetes, there's 2 different types. So type 2 diabetes, which is the one that most people are probably more familiar with because it's the one that's more prevalent. the body is resistant to the insulin. So when the body, gets the carbs, it sends out the insulin doesn't work very well. And so the body has to keep sending out more and more insulin. So it ends up that they have just high insulin levels because they're resistant to the insulin. So their body makes insulin. But in type 2, the immune system, and they're not sure really why it does it. One theory is that it's viruses, that something triggers an immune attack on the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. And so as they just die out because they're attacked, the body has no cells that make insulin. And so these people, when they eat, have to inject insulin because their body can't make it at all.
So that's type 1. Right. So type 1, the pancreas isn't making insulin. Type 2, people are making insulin. It's just not being used properly or efficiently.
Right.
And then what are some of the symptoms? You mentioned in your son frequent urination. What are some of the symptoms that parents could be keeping an eye out for that might show that a child is developing or has developed diabetes?
Okay, sure. And one thing that's really important is there's a lot of misdiagnoses. I see it, not frequently, but I see it several kids a year actually die from the diabetes not being diagnosed because it mimics a lot of other things like the flu. So there's a big movement kind of out in the diabetes world of trying to make sure that primary care doctors are checking blood sugars in order to catch it. But the most common symptoms are just increased thirst, which helps, which kind of I guess makes people have the increased urination. In younger children, a lot of times this is bedwetting. Like with my daughter, she was in kindergarten and had not wet the bed in years, and all of a sudden 4 nights in a row she was wetting the bed. So it kind of triggered me to, let's go check her blood sugar, and it was high. Another thing is that they're very hungry and they can eat and eat and eat, but they're losing weight because what they're eating, the body's not absorbing it, so they're losing weight. And then just as a result of not getting the energy from the food, they're tired. They can have blurred vision. Sometimes they're diagnosed when they actually go to the eye doctor. And then the longer it goes on, they can start having ketones, which is like a fruity smelling breath, which leads to nausea, vomiting, and then trouble breathing. And then like in the worst kind of cases, it ends up getting into confusion, which can go into a coma where they end up being hospitalized. And that's where if they aren't taken to the emergency room, they can actually, can lead to death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are really strong signs. They're not super subtle, really. If you're aware of them, those are good, strong signs. What about, Sylvia, what about the genetics involved with type 1 diabetes? Because, for example, my father-in-law was a type 1 diabetic, and there was a lot of talk about, I know my husband went and had himself checked at one point in his life to see if he was likely to develop diabetes. I think at one point it was suggested that we might our children might get tested because we're skipping a generation. What is behind all that? Do you know, and what do you know about sort of the genetic link?
Yeah, when my son was diagnosed, we were told that there was not very much of a genetic link to it, that it's been 10 years, and now there's actually a lot more studies on that. When my children were diagnosed, when Josh was diagnosed, we all went down to Florida and we're part of a big study that's a national study called TrialNet, where if you have anyone in your immediate family, all the other family members can be tested. And they're checking for those antibodies.
The antibodies that destroy the pancreas?
Yes. So they're trying. So any siblings or any child that is diagnosed, usually the parents and all the siblings get tested for it. And the siblings can be tested every year until they're 18. So So there's a lot of studies into all that.
There does seem to be a genetic link on some level then.
Yes. But there's a lot of people that are diagnosed and have absolutely no family history at all. Like in my family, I have a first cousin with it, and that's all. My husband doesn't have anyone in his family. And I've seen a family where there's 3 out of 4 children have it. And then and none of the parents or grandparents or cousins.
Wow. Okay. So a family has a child who gets diagnosed with diabetes. What are the next steps?
They used to immediately put the child in the hospital and would keep them in the hospital several days for training. Now they try to keep them out of the hospital if they're diagnosed early. Like neither of my children were ever put in the hospital, but I had to go in every day and meet with a diabetes educator and a dietitian one day to just continuously get educated. So when they're first diagnosed, they're sent to an endocrinologist, which is a doctor that specializes in diabetes. And then some offices have what's called a CDE, or a certified diabetes educator, in the office. Other ones have to send it out. So the endocrinologist will start them on insulin, and then they're taught how to check their blood sugars, how to give insulin doses. And they start meeting with the diabetes educator to start just learning all there is about diabetes. So some of the very first things that they have to know is how to check their blood sugar and how to give insulin is the most important thing. So like when my son was diagnosed, we learned that the first day, and then we had to come back. And they said, don't worry about the eating for right now. You just need the insulin to get into you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're breaking it down to the first thing is learn how to check your blood sugar and learn how to give insulin. Mm-hmm. And then you move into food.
Well, and then we kind of move into more, and actually food, even though it's probably, one of the most important aspects of it, it's the last thing that typically is taught. Because when they come in, we want to adjust the insulin doses based on how they're normally eating. We tell them just eat normal, and we're going to adjust the doses and try and figure that out without you changing something. Because if all of a sudden they quit eating all the carb foods, then their insulin doses won't be right.
Ah, okay.
So that, after learning to check blood sugars and learning to give shots, then we start teaching them about this is what you do for high blood sugars, this is what you do for low blood sugars. Because treating the lows is definitely a huge aspect of it. And they've got to know, if they're given insulin, they've got the risk of a low blood sugar, so they have to know what to do.
And so what would be some examples of what a family would need to know to do if their child had a low blood sugar?
So they have a low blood sugar, any symptoms where we teach them, these are the symptoms that you would feel, like feeling shaky, anxious, your heartbeat is rapid. So we kind of tell them, watch your kids, and if you notice anything where they're looking funny or something, check their blood sugar. And then if it's less than 70, sometimes we use 80 for kids if they're younger, you treat it by giving 15 grams of a sugar carb food. You want to use pure sugar versus something like chocolate that has fat in it, because that'll slow down the rise. You want to get just sugar in there where the blood sugar will come up quickly.
Got it. And what are some examples of foods that would give 15 grams of carbs in a pure sugar form?
So even though you kind of think something like a soda is terrible for kids, but we tell them to get half a cup of a real soda, not a diet soda, because you need the sugar, or half a cup of juice. There's glucose tabs, although they kind of taste funny, so a lot of times kids won't do those, but 3 or 4 glucose tabs. And then a real popular one is actually a little handful of Skittles. So we kind of tell them, the thing is, one of the jokes in the diabetes communities is Easter and Halloween, like all your holidays, are the best time to stock up on your low blood sugar foods, because they all come in those little individual packets.
And they all provide about 15 grams of carbs, I assume.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So all those little mini packs of candy is usually about 15 grams.
Oh, very interesting. That's very convenient. That's kind of a nice little thing.
Yeah. So we stock up, the day after Valentine's or Easter because they go on sale.
Right. Okay. So what are the symptoms of a high blood sugar, and what do you tell families to do for that?
So the high blood sugar, some people feel it. A lot of people don't feel it, which is why when we're teaching them to check their blood sugars, we're teaching them a minimal of checking 4 times a day. And usually in children, they're checking 8 to 10 to 12 times a day. Like my daughter could be 500 or 600 and not feel any different than if she's 100. So a lot of it is just, in the beginning, we teach them check before every meal, check 2 hours after meals. Some people, though, will feel more tired, and then they'll also start, feeling more thirsty or urinating more. Kind of some of the symptoms that would be a diagnosis symptom, because that's when your blood sugar is getting high.
Sure. And then just for the listeners, what's the downside of running high blood sugars? What happens?
So just the longer, if you have long-term high blood sugars, that increases your risk of all the different complications that you hear about with diabetes. Kidney problems, eye problems, nerve problems, kidney problems. Yeah.
Got it. So what are the some of the challenges of just having diabetes, having a child with diabetes that you hear as a professional who's caring for these kids and their families? What are some of the challenges, and what are the upsides and maybe some of the downsides of these challenges?
I think the biggest challenge in the beginning is all the worry that the parents have. They're worried about, will their child be normal? Will their child be able to do what other children do? Usually what people know about diabetes is they've heard about people with all the complications. So people tend to go to the worst case scenario. I know that's what I did personally when my son was diagnosed, because I had worked in a dialysis unit. I knew what it was about. And it actually took someone telling me, you see all these people that are in the hospital, but you don't see all the, huge amount of the other ones who take good care of themselves and they don't end up in the hospital or have complications. So a lot of times that's just the biggest thing, is kind of getting through the worry. Then another thing is a lot of just worrying about who's going to take care of my child. Mm-hmm. Because even to go play with somebody at somebody's house, you've got to educate the parents of what to do. All that the parents had to learn in 4 or 5 days, you've got to tell that to somebody else in 15 minutes. Mm. So a lot of times these parents don't get a break.
Yeah. Well, and that's a challenge, just the fear and the worry around raising a child who feels like they're as socially inclined and able as everyone else.
Right. And that's the thing, is these kids can go on and do, anything other kids do. Both of mine played sports. My son's gone off to college. He's actually went overseas for 3 months for a study abroad, and did perfectly fine, over there. They end up becoming very responsible at a young age because they're forced to.
Right. So that leads me to ask the question about insulin, because you said in the beginning of diagnosis, a lot of kids are giving themselves the parents are giving the child several shots a day. And that sounds like it might be just the beginning phase. Do families do that, long term? Are there other technologies to provide insulin that are a little bit more efficient and less human intensive, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Definitely in the beginning, they start on, usually 4 to 5 to 6 shots a day, which for little kids is traumatic. And for the parents having to give the shots to the kids, they hate doing it. So one thing that we try to move them into is something called an insulin pump. So the insulin pumps, you insert with a needle, something called a cannula, which is a little tube under the skin, and the needle comes out and it's just this little tube under your skin. And then this device constantly gives insulin. It drips in, and then when they eat, they're able to just program in on the little screen. It's like a little computer, kind of looks like a little smartphone but smaller. And they program in how many carbs they eat and what their blood sugar is. So if their blood sugar is high, the pump figures how much they need extra to lower their blood sugar, and then it figures out how much insulin to give based on how many carbs they put in. So the more carbs they put in, the higher the dose. And then they just push a button and it goes through without doing a shot.
Wow. But where's the insulin coming from? Is it you're adding a vial of insulin to that cannula, or?
Yeah, so actually in the pump, every 3 days you're changing out this cannula piece, which is called an infusion set, and then you're changing out something called a reservoir, which is where you take a vial of insulin and you put in only 3 days worth of insulin into that reservoir, because we don't want to waste an insulin. But once the insulin comes from a glass bottle and it hits plastic, it starts degrading. So you have to change it every 3 days. So that's actually in the little pump that is attached to them with a tube, and they clip it in their, on their pants or stick it in pockets. For younger kids, they have little backpacks they can put them in, and very creative work out there.
Wow, I would say. And then I think you also had told me before we went live that there were continuous glucose monitors that were out there as well that families use. Tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah, so this is a, relative, within probably the last, I'd say 6 or 8 years or so, kind of a new thing. So this is where similar to like a pump where a cannula goes in, but it's like a little wire that's under their skin, and they last 6 or 7 days, and then it continuously reads the blood sugar, giving a reading every 5 minutes. So that reading can be seen on either a pump, or it can go to what's called a receiver, which gives a little graph of what the blood sugars are, or it can actually go on a phone. And with the phone application, this is great because the kids could be at school, and the school nurse in the office could have the app on their phone and see if their blood sugar drops low, and the parents could have it on their phone also. So with this technology, if their blood sugars start dropping low, it would beep at them and alert the parents or the child. And then if it's getting high, based on what settings you put in there, it would beep if they're getting high. So that's the great technology out there now. It really helps the parents have more peace of mind, especially like overnight and while they're away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So all of this is a lot of this is within the last 10 years. I remember 20 years ago when I was working, I think it was 20 years ago when I was working in the hospital setting, and the kids who were newly diagnosed with diabetes would come get admitted, much of what you described earlier, but a pump was not even part of that was what was the future on the horizon. It was not part of the reality at all. And now, just even in the last 20 years, things have advanced so much. So what's in store in the next 10 years?
Well, the newest thing is what they're referring to as called the artificial pancreas. So with the current pumps, the pumps give just an hourly dripping or dose of insulin, but if your blood sugar is high, you have to, or the child has to input their blood sugar and give an extra dose manually through the pump. So the newest thing is what's called an artificial pancreas. Medtronic will have one that's released in April, I think, where if the blood sugar, like if they're wearing that continuous monitor that I talked about, if they're wearing that and it sees that their blood sugars are getting high, the pump will automatically give more doses, a higher dose of insulin. And then if they're starting to drop, the pump backs off on that hourly rate. So it kind of is adjusting it itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, right now there's 4 different pump companies out there. So all of the pump companies are moving toward this automated system where the pump can actually do everything for you as long as you're just wearing it. You're not having to input blood sugars or input carbs. So that's kind of the whole new, right now there's a big push to actually get it totally integrated and going all by itself. a lot of research dollars into that right now.
Yeah. So how would that just practically, would that also be implanted in a patient, or would they carry it on their back? How does that, how do you see that sort of practically being applied?
So it would be the same as how now they would have just an insulin pump, which would, and it's small, 2 to 3 inches, maybe 2 inches by 3 inches, and maybe half an inch is that thick. It's a little small. It's much smaller than an actual smartphone. And it clips to their, belt or pocket or whatever, and then it has a tube that runs into this infusion set where the insulin goes in. So these artificial pancreas pumps would be the same thing. It just has more technology in the pump as far as the computer system and algorithms of the pump. But the actual how it works is still the same. Like it's still going in with a tube. You've got the continuous monitor is another device that's under your skin that you're changing every 6 or 7 days. And we teach the kids and the parents, they do this by themselves at home. You don't go into the hospital to have anything done.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. So when you're working with families and they've been diagnosed and you're managing them over time, I'm sure they're coming back and checking in every year anyways for just their growth, their insulin requirements, I'm sure, and things of that nature. Their calorie requirements change over time. What is it that you really focus on in terms of talking with the parents and sort of coaching them through living with diabetes?
Well, the main thing, like when they're coming in, we do get them into, we have to teach them how to do carb counting. So as the children start getting older, we're having to make sure the kids are doing this correctly, and the parents, over time, people tend to slack off, and I know even I do, and you tend to kind of think, oh, that's a 45-gram carb meal. So we have to kind of teach them, go back and, measure for a week and make sure you're getting the portions right. So the carb counting is probably the biggest thing that I tend to kind of keep going over, and we try to encourage them to come back every, year to 2 years. And definitely as the kids start getting older, especially like teenage years where they're doing it themselves. Because a lot of times they're diagnosed when they're young and the parents are trained, but the kids aren't necessarily trained. So as they get older, we've got to move into training the teenagers and the young adults, because they're the ones doing it.
Right.
Yeah. And then a big thing is going to school or daycare. So the schools, at least in the United States, have, as part of the American Disabilities Act, where they have to take care of the children with diabetes right now. And so the doctor will write a care plan of what the school nurse or designated person has to do for this child with diabetes. And that's a huge worry for the parents, because they've been, for a couple of weeks right after diagnosis, they probably keep their kids home and they're taking care of them, and to just hand them over to a nurse is very scary. And then it's not just the nurse, but you've got to educate the teachers, and if they're in multiple classes, the gym coach, the librarian. It's a lot more than people kind of would think that it is, and the bus driver even.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's my son doesn't have diabetes, but he has food allergies, and every year I'm like, we have to go through this whole process, probably on some level somewhat similar to what parents and families with diabetes have to do. But yeah, the nurses have to know, and the teachers. And actually, my son now is in high school, and this is the first year where he basically carries all of his his epinephrine and his Benadryl. He carries it all with him, because the nurse's office is at one end of the school, and most of the time he's at the other end of the school. And they give you the option to keep epinephrine in the nurse's office for him versus him carrying. I was like, that's a no-brainer for me. I want him to carry, because I don't want him to have to run half a mile down to the nurse's office if he's having an allergic reaction. Right, yeah. And that's kind of a big deal, too, with the children with diabetes. Sometimes they don't want the kids to have their meters with them and, the food with them. And so they'll say, well, you've got to go, like you're saying, halfway across the school just to get food if your blood sugar is low. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, a lot of time it's negotiating with the school as to this child has to have the food with him or the meter with him. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the common myths that surround diabetes. I can bring one up that kids, I'm sure, worry about, and that's the fact that they can never have dessert again.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably the biggest thing. And I know when my son was diagnosed, they kept telling me, well, just, have him eat normal. Do not change anything that you do. And I can remember going to the grocery store as a dietitian and just being so overwhelmed looking at stuff. And this was before I actually met with a dietitian. So I finally met with a dietitian, probably the fourth day or something. And I said, hey, I'm a dietitian, but treat me like anybody else, just, like I don't know anything. And the biggest thing is we tell them eat normally like any other child would do. The only difference is you have to learn to count your carbs to give the insulin for it. So they can still eat sugar. They could still eat a candy bar. If they're having a party at school, which is a whole nother, thing that parents worry about is, you think of all the birthday parties when kids have a birthday at school and they bring in cupcakes, or the Christmas parties, or, all the different parties they have at school. So we tell them go on and eat all of that, but you have to let the nurse or whoever's watching over you know exactly what you ate so that you can get the right insulin dose.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We don't encourage them to go eat lots of sugar, obviously, because it's not good for anyone, but it's okay for them to eat normal foods.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And what about a cure for diabetes? Is that a myth or a truth?
So right now, there is no cure. A lot of times people, well-meaning people, but they'll, tell you, well, if you, feed your child cinnamon, it'll cure them. Or if you do okra juice is a big one. Or, all these different things. Or if you would eat healthier and make them exercise more, then they could get off of their insulin. But with type 1, you can't, because the body doesn't make the insulin. So there's no getting off of the insulin. There's a lot of research out there right now. There's a big study in Boston where they're giving people a TB vaccine and hoping to stimulate the body to make insulin again. There's a big study at a couple of the big universities where they're actually implanting the islet cells, which are the cells that make insulin, trying to get the body to start regenerating, the insulin. And then they're looking at, in the beginning, there's a lot of different studies trying to slow down the cells being destroyed by the body. Because when they're first diagnosed, they still have some capability of making insulin. All the cells haven't been destroyed. So they're trying to preserve, what they have. There's a lot of research out there.
Yeah.
Right? No cure. But right now, there is no cure.
Okay. Any other myths that you commonly hear that you want to sort of dispel right now while I've got you on the show?
I think a huge thing is parents, when their kids are diagnosed, they think, what did I do to cause this? And there's nothing that they did. It was an autoimmune response. They have to lose the guilt that they didn't do anything. And just kind of, move on from there and just learn to take care of it. And, these kids can go on and have a normal life. They have a normal life expectancy as long as their blood sugars are controlled. You can avoid complications. There's a lot of studies out there. There was a big, long study that showed how having a good control prevents all the complications. They can go on and do the only things that people with diabetes cannot do is drive a commercial truck or fly a commercial plane or join the military. Other than that, they're wide open. And these kids become very resilient, very responsible people. They bounce back, and then they're very caring individuals, with other people that have health problems or other problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as we wrap this up, you've given so much great information and practical information from a personal standpoint and from a professional standpoint, which I really appreciate, and I know the listeners will appreciate that as well. I'm curious as to what your favorite resources are for parents on the topic of type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, so there's a couple of great books. I know when kids are diagnosed, there's what's called a Pink Panther diabetes book, and that's probably the most common one. A lot of the clinics get these for free and give them out. So that's a very great resource. The only thing is it's almost too much information sometimes for them. So it's kind of great later on once they get accustomed to it. So that's a great book. For people that are on pumps, there's a good book called Pumping Insulin, which teaches all kinds of, aspects on the pump. And then I'm actually in the process of writing a book, especially for kids, called Pumping Kids. That's going to be, more about, pumps with kids and how to kind of get over the different things that they struggle with. As far as carb counting, a great guide is the ADA Guide to Carb Counting. And then there's actually lots of phone apps that we always recommend that they download. Like there's one called Calorie King that has all the restaurants, and you can just click on the restaurant and click on the item, and it pops up and says how many carbs that there are in there. Then a great resource is the JDRF, which is the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. They have a program called the Bag of Hope, and any newly diagnosed child the parent can request this Bag of Hope. So in this, it's a big backpack, and it has all these different kind of fun items for the kids, and then it's a lot of educational items for the parent. But then the greatest part is there's this little teddy bear called Rufus, and Rufus has a diabetes medical alert bracelet on, and then he has little patches where they would prick their fingers or like everywhere that a shot can be given, like on the abdomen or the back of the arm or the legs. And so they can actually practice on Rufus. And then Rufus comes with several different books, like, when he's first diagnosed and what he experiences. And then there's one called Rufus Goes to School that's made to be read to classmates to teach them about, just kind of very basics of diabetes. So that's a really great resource. And then another one, a good one, is Disney has teamed up with Lilly. Lilly is one of the companies that makes insulin. And so there's a site called T1everydaymagic.com. And then they have lots of resources, and then they have lots of actual books that are Disney characters that have diabetes. So there's one of the little characters, and he goes to a birthday party, and it kind of talks about what to do for a birthday party. And, there's several, as they grow older, there's, books like a person on a basketball team has diabetes, and it's a story about them. And there's one with a girl that she plays soccer and has diabetes. So that's a really great resource there.
That's awesome. Those are some really targeted to children resources, which is really great. That's wonderful. Mm-hmm. So, Sylvia, it's been so great to have you on the show. And I know there are probably tons of listeners that want to know where they can find you and your work. I know you write a blog. Can you tell us a little bit about how people can find you and find your work?
Yeah, sure. My blog is called parentingdiabetes.com, and I try and I do some recipes, but I do a lot of just educational. There's a whole new to diabetes section that's kind of goes back over checking your blood sugars, how to treat lows, how to treat highs, just a good general overview of diabetes when the parents are so overwhelmed and forget what all you learned in the beginning. I have a free email course that they can sign up where they just get 5 tips. It's a series of 5 emails that go over different things that you don't necessarily think about, like grief is the first one, because they're actually grieving over the loss of a healthy child. So there's a lot of things that that I go through, and finding support is a huge thing, because a lot of these children and parents feel very alone, like they're the only ones doing this. So that's a great course to go through. And then through the website, theparentingdiabetes.com, they can always click on my Twitter, my Pinterest, the Facebook group, and then there's a contact me. So feel free to send in questions or whatever. I definitely check all those personally myself. So.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, I will include all those links in the show notes so people can trek on over to your website and your blog and find out more about you and more information about diabetes.
Okay. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you so much, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this.
You bet. Well, there you have it, folks. I want to wrap this show up, but offer up a huge thanks to Sylvia for joining me today and giving us a lot of good information on type 1 diabetes in children, how to manage it, and how to keep the right perspective. I think a couple of points that she made really stood out to me. Number one, there's a lot of fear around parents who are experiencing the initial diagnosis of type 1 diabetes in their child. They fear their children are going to have horrible complications. And Sylvia reminds us that the research shows that when children have good control of their blood sugars, they can go on to have a very normal life expectancy and can do most anything they want to do. She also reminds us, and I think this is a silver lining, I think, is that children with type 1 diabetes become very resilient and very, very empathetic and caring to others. They understand hurdles and they understand how to overcome them. And I think she made that point really, really clear. I really appreciated that. And she also reminds parents that making some time for yourself to get away from your child, to make sure your child learns early on how to monitor their blood sugar, how to treat highs and lows, and to inform those around your child that may be taking care of him, such as a babysitter or a teacher or a friend, another mother, if your child's on a play date, is really important. A lot of parents who are parents of children with diabetes, they don't get a lot of breaks because it's hard to have somebody else take over the care of your child. So if you have a friend, offer to help out if you can. That will be, I'm sure, very meaningful for the family. I'm so glad you listened in to the Nourished Child podcast today. I hope that you will help me help the Nourished Child podcast grow. You can write a review on iTunes. Certainly you can subscribe to the show on iTunes or Android, Stitcher Radio, Google+, Tuned In, and more. You'll find all the links to subscribe on the show notes over at www.jillcastle.com/028. I'd love it if you shared the podcast on social media, your Facebook page, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, wherever you hang out. I have some new resources I've uploaded to my website. I think some of them you will really enjoy. One of them is called the Healthy Snack Planner for Kids. This is a planner, a guide, and an idea creator for parents who are trying to feed their children healthier snacks. I teach you who needs a snack, what is a good healthy snack, when it should be served and where, as well as give you plenty of ideas for combinations of foods that make up a healthy snack and 85 snack ideas. You can find that Healthy Snack Planner for Kids on my website, www.jillcastle.com/books authored by Jill Castle, or as a shortcut, just go to the books tab on my website. As always, thank you for joining me today. I'm very glad you were here. And as always, if you have a child in your life, please be sure to give him or her a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.